Good morning. My name's Lorene. Welcome to Books at the Bottom of the Stairs. This is the third week that I am speaking about Nonfiction November, and for this week I read The Whisper on the Night Wind by Adam Shoalt. He is the, where is he? Right, explorer in residence at the Royal Canadian Geographical Society. This is a Canadian book and published by Penguin. Now he's written other things, let me see, Alone Against the North, A History of Canada in 10 Maps, which I think we might have, and Beyond the Trees. He's a fairly good story writer. I think that, in terms of the craft of writing, he does a good job. There are well-constructed paragraphs, well-constructed sentences. He's not all over the place in terms of magical, mystical adjectives and descriptions that are sort of freelance poetry, if you like. I don't know, does that make any sense? But I enjoyed this to some degree. Well, you know what? Last night I couldn't sleep. I finished it yesterday evening-ish, and then I couldn't sleep last night for whatever reasons, and kept thinking about this book. And when I finished the book, I didn't feel satisfied. So I guess I should start with telling you what is the book about. There is a legend that took place up towards in Labrador, where currently it's Goose Bay, Happy Valley. And at the time of this legend, those were not connected communities. And sort of across this bay, fairly big bay up there, there is a small settlement of about 3 houses, and it was called Traverse Spine. And it was developed by a family with the last name of Michelin. So there were people who did trapping, not much farming because there's really no arable land up there, fishing, hunting, and subsistence living to some degree. And it was a pretty rough and tough place to live, very, very physical, very, very connected to the weather and those kinds of lifestyles. And the legend came up in the early 1900s. So it turns out that there was some kind of a being that had weird footprints and was seeming to be stalking the people around Traverse Spine. They were not actually being attacked or anything, but the dogs were being frightened and into the water. There was a certain amount of disturbance around the land. There was weird noises. There was knocking and scratching, and so all these stories started to crop up about what was going on. Then one of the kids saw this thing. It had a white ruff around its neck. It was 7 feet tall. The tracks were quite large, and over time, this story traveled. And so was it the same creature that had moved around to other smaller settlements? At some point there was a second creature that seemed to be smaller and not so pronounced in the coloration. What could it be? Well, their first thought was bear, which makes sense. There's a lot of bear up there. Could it have been an albino bear? Could it have been a polar bear? So, there was no agreement on that particular idea because people there knew what bear tracks looked like. Okay, so there was no agreement that it was about bears, and though what ended up happening was sort of a weird legend that just never really identified what this being was, and it ended up in the boogeyman kind of camp of things. And then our author, Adam Shoalt, is a historian, archaeologist, geographer, and did his PhD on the impact that First Nations legends and myths had on settlers. And so the idea of the Wendigo being, which is like a supernatural, windy, kind of cannibalistic kind of a creature. And there are other sorts of similar things from different First Nations stories. Could this have influenced the story? Because his thinking was that the trappers would have spent time with people from the local First Nations groups, and stories would have been told around the fire. Now we also have a French-Canadian tradition of stories of the werewolf. I think, what's it called? Carcagaru, I think was the word for werewolf. And so there's a French-Canadian kind of input in terms of mythical animals that will be consuming livestock or humans, or hunting them down and stalking them and killing them for the fun of it. So there's all these kinds of creepy stories. And Adam decides that he's going to investigate this. And so he and his buddy Zach, they decide to drive up to Goose Bay, Happy Valley, and take a small canoe across this really bad stretch of water and head up. And this is where, this is where I start to get a little bit grumpy because I think, why didn't you just fly up by plane instead of driving for 4 days? And it's just across the water. Why are you waiting till September when the water's really bad? Why didn't you go a little bit earlier when the water was calmer, taking a motorboat? This is me, right? Like, I can't always get into whatever the author is doing. And so, I think it's like reader error, user error. From there, they decide that they're going to continue canoeing. And in order to get where it's a little bit like sailing, and you've got a tack in the winds. Here you've got a canoe in such a way that you're not being hit broadside by the waves. So they've got to go on this angle, which takes them sort of out of their way, and then they backtrack to a stream, and then up in the stream, which just seems like a whole lot of work. Oh my God. And they get to where they finally think they want to go, and it's only 3.5 miles from where they finally leave the canoe, and they want to get across to the mountain. They're called the Mealy Mountains, and they're the oldest mountain track, and one of the oldest in the world, but certainly one of the oldest in Canada. And so it's 3.5 miles across some really bad spruce forests and some bog and some tundra, and it takes them a day and a half to make this cross, just because of the terrain. And waders are being pierced by sharp branches. Their clothes are getting ripped by sharp branches. They're eating berries along the way. They're mostly subsisting on granola bars and dry pack meals and so on. They're not hungry in any kind of a way. Water is an issue because you've got to get your water in such a way that it's like at least clear running water. They get to the top of the mountains. They make, some surveying kinds of photographs. They come back down. They head back to the canoe around a different way, and then they retrace their steps. That's the journey. So along the way, he has taken his photocopies of all the research that he had done prior to leaving, and they're sort of chatting back and forth about, could this logically have been some sort of undiscovered animal? Could there possibly be a North American gorilla? Well, probably the wolves would have taken the gorillas out, especially if it was a single entity. It wouldn't have stood a chance against, for all those years. And so there's all this logic being applied to the legend, and they're breaking it apart. They're deconstructing it. And by having gone to Traverse Spine, they are living in the place where the legend originated. And what the author does is keeps up this creepy tone about when they're in bed. He's reading these creepy stories and retellings and so on, and there's something against the tent, and then there's and every time they're camping at night, they're going, oh, I feel like something's watching me. I feel like something's watching me. So there's a gothic feel to this book. There is a feeling of, I just don't want to take another step in this book because they're so cold, they're so wet, this stupid canoe. I would have like thrown the canoe down and had an absolute temper tantrum somewhere in the first 2 hours of the whole journey. They stick it out. They're like, you know, physical guys. They really, this is cool. This is their jam. It's okay to just go for 6 hours dragging a canoe up a rapid-filled stream. I mean, I guess some people would look at me sitting there for knitting for 3 hours and think, what an insane thing to do. I guess we all have our crazy shit, right? So one of the things that occurred to me, which I think is hilarious, is Thoreau and his idea of the wilderness is quoted several times in here. And like, I'm just getting a kick out of everybody who keeps quoting Thoreau. I was thinking to myself, these guys are in hip waders. They're in like basically polypropylene clothing in order to keep the water out and the wind down and all this kind of stuff. And I have this vision of Thoreau kind of walking along in a suit that's got a vest that buttons up, you know, a coat and a muffler and some nice leather boots and stuff. And he's the kind of guy who would wear checked socks. And I think his coat would have been too short and his mittens would, and so I think that he would have had a gap of skin. And so, you know, Thoreau's walking along in his farmland talking about how good it is to be out in nature and see the wilderness. And, you know, the nearest carnivore in his world would have been a squirrel. And these guys are trekking along thinking, oh, that's another bear track. Oh, that's another bear track. I think there's a lot of bears around here. Yeah, I bet there is. It's Labrador. So, why would you quote Thoreau? I don't know. But anyhow, it's a story that circles around on itself because each time we get to a different geographical spot, the author reviews his case notes, as it were, and comes up with another clue or another idea, and so one of the storytelling devices he uses is this recounting of reviewing his notes and then chatting with his buddy Zachary the next day and just going, well, what do you think of this idea? What do you think of that idea? And they toss these ideas back and forth, and just through their experience of having been explorers and wild woodsmen, if you like, they come to a lot of conclusions that eliminate possibility. And we get to the very end of the book, and the story has pretty much lost its campfire-ness. The story has been deconstructed in such a way that if I was to hear it, you know, sitting around a campfire and someone started to tell that story, I'd go, oh, yeah, it turned out to be a beaver. It wasn't a beaver. That's not a spoiler. But I think that along the way, I had an idea, two different ideas. The one idea I had almost immediately, and then I second-guessed myself, and then I had a second idea, and I think it was the right idea. Well, actually, I know it was the right idea, but, you know, if you choose to read this, it isn't really worth your while to try and outguess these guys because it just circles around so many times that, like, you know, was it a bear? Yeah, no, yes, no, yes. So, it's not confused writing. It's very circular writing, I guess. And we keep coming back to the question of what is the point. I guess that's a sub-theme in the book, is what is the point or the use of these myths in the first place? And what is the intersection between the different cultures, whether you're French Canadian or Scots or First Nations or so on, and in terms of these storytelling elements. And another piece is just a discussion of the kinds of supernatural creatures that are out there. This is a book for people who don't mind a single-minded plot. It's if you've got someone in your group that really likes adventure or hardship or beating the odds, this is a great book. If you like someone who wants living in the wilds, and you really get to know around what it's like to be living out of a canoe with just your backpack, and what it's like to be up in the Barrens of Labrador with the wind coming in, and your tent not necessarily being well staked. If you like a little bit of scratching on the walls at night, this is a good book too. I think actually we have a friend in our family who is one of these guys who in the winter likes to climb frozen waterfalls. I think he'll like this book. And my brother, who's a fisherman, he likes to go up into northern Ontario and do some fishing there. And although I am 100% sure that he would not leave the campsite and just say to himself, let me see, can I do this by myself with only one day's worth of food? No, he would never do that. He'd be more like, where's the fridge? So, so for your adventurer kind of guy or person, I think if you're looking for a Canadian kind of history book, this is very interesting. Or if someone has to do a project on a Canadian author or a Canadian piece of history, then this would also be a good resource because it is nonfiction. One of the things coming out of this, and Steve and I were chatting about this briefly, was that there is a very famous explorer and map maker called David Thompson. And I have a feeling that somewhere in the house there's a book by him, but I think I'd like to follow up. He was one of the people that started exploring Canada and mapping it, and mostly from the waterways, I believe, if I remember everything correctly. So I think I'm going to put that on my radar for another time. And would I recommend this book? Yeah, to certain, as I say, certain kinds of readers. Would the average, well, you know what? Those of you who like memoir are going to love this because it's totally memoir. So yeah, there's quite a lot of people I think who would like this, and it's certainly a good Canadian book. I think this is going to be my last single book for a week. I still haven't finished off the other two that I was reading partially, Blue Legacy and Black Feminism by Angela Davies, and The Tides of Time. Now this one is just, I don't know, it's just been so disappointing. I'm not sure if I'll even continue with it. But this one I really do enjoy, and I'm going to focus on it next week and just see if I can get that done for the final week of Nonfiction November. And in watching other people's videos, this was recommended, The Gilded Page, The Secret Lives of Medieval Manuscripts by Mary Wellesley. So let me just get you a better picture of the cover. It is about understanding medieval people and the manuscripts and how they came to be and what they were used for and who read them, and just kind of a very nice overview of medieval books. But I'm not going to try and get that done for November. I'm going to just enjoy that one as I go. So that's it for me. I hope all your reading dreams and adventures continue to come true, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye for now.